Delighted to welcome you to this face-to-face lecture, which is part of the AHRC-funded project, Grieve, a Study of Human Emotional Experience, based at the University of York. And this is our first face-to-face lecture for, I think, 21 months, so it's really great to have Rupert Reed here. Rupert is a philosopher who's been based for a long while now at the University of, UEA in Norwich, and he's very well known for his important contributions to Wittgenstein scholarship and for applying Wittgensteinian thought in various different areas. And over the years he's become increasingly concerned with ecological issues, and he's an active climate and environment campaigner. He has sat as are you currently sitting as a Green Party councillor?
No, I served 2 terms.
2 terms as a Green Party councillor, and has also stood on behalf of the Green Party in European and national elections, and he's also been a spokesperson for Extinction Rebellion. And his book, Parents for a Future, was published in January this year. He's also, as I can see from what's on this table, written quite a few other relevant books, and we'll be delighted to hear that afterwards there'll be a chance to look through them, and if you want a signed copy, even to buy one for a mere 10 quid each. So the way this is going to work, we're going to have a talk for about 45 minutes, then 45 minutes discussion, and then Rupert will stay for a while for informal discussion around the table, when you can look at the books and things. But without further ado, I'll hand over to Rupert, whose talk today is entitled How Eco-Grief Will Help Us Save Ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for coming. It is a pleasure to be here in person. Now I'm just going to turn on my mic that will project my voice a bit more. There we go, great. Is that good? Is that a good volume? Yeah. So, ecological grief is my topic, but I'm going to start out by speaking with you about ordinary grief, or common or garden grief, grief over bereavement, and that will be the basis from which I, as it were, project onto ecological grief. So a few minutes on ordinary grief. We were talking about this earlier. It's very hard to find a way of describing the sort of classic, typical case of grief without making it sound less than it is, because grief is it's a formidable and often appalling experience to go through. One might say that it's never ordinary to the person who undergoes it. And I'm speaking partly here from personal experience. I want to tell you a tiny bit about my own strongest experience with grief, which is when my best friend was lost several years ago. We use this peculiar word, lost. You know, it's a very sort of gentle euphemism, for somebody being wrenched away from us in one way or another. In my case, it's sort of slightly literally accurate. My friend Matt was lost at sea. His body was never found, which is a peculiarly kind of indeterminate, in a certain sense, way for someone to be taken from you, and no possibility of a funeral with a body and that kind of thing. So in the days and weeks and months after Matt was lost, I had various peculiar and striking experiences, including dreams where he was vividly present and alive, and I woke up, in a certain sense, convinced that he was still alive. And also an experience one time of having a realization prompted by reflection on having lost him, upon which my immediate thought was, oh, I really want to speak with Matt about this. And it took me a second to remember, oh no, of course, he's precisely the person I can't speak with about it. One way in which these kinds of experiences are described in the literature is as experiences of denial. There's a certain sense in which I was in denial about the fact that he was dead. And Elizabeth Kubler-Ross writes about this very famously. Many of you will have heard of this. She talks about 5 stages of grief. And those 5 stages, she says, are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And I think her typology is quite useful. One thing which I think is sort of missing from it is that as I see grief, as I understand grief, all of these 5 stages, or rather all of the first 4, are versions of the 5th one. They're all modes of acceptance. Even denial is a mode of acceptance. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that the way that I was coming to accept Matt's absence, the way that I was coming to accept that my world had fundamentally changed and his world had ended, was by way of these bizarre experiences of dreams, of momentary kind of denials of his being dead. Denial, it sounds paradoxical. It is paradoxical, but nevertheless I think it's true. Denial in the case of grief is a mode too. It's a transitional vehicle towards acceptance. It's the way that we integrate these experiences into our lives. A particularly vivid example of this is when people see ghosts. I would argue that many occurrences, possibly most occurrences of people seeing ghosts, are roughly a version of what I've just described. The ghost is a sort of spectral presence of the one who has been taken away, but who is still somehow present to one in one's lived experience, because the world doesn't make sense with that person who is so integral to it taken away from one. The world doesn't make sense without that person in the world. You can't accept that they're not in the world. You're in denial about it. So the way you come to slowly accept it is by temporarily having them have this kind of ambivalent kind of presence, a phantom presence, a spectral presence. I didn't experience that in the literal way with Matt. I have, however, experienced it once earlier in my life when I lost a beloved companion animal, a cat, who was also significantly younger than myself and who died unexpectedly. And in the weeks after the cat died, his name was Angelo, I would see him out of the corner of my eye. I would see him like jumping across the back of the sofa or something. So I said, whoa, that's Angelo. Oh, no, of course it's not, he's dead. Yeah, so a little hypothesis there, that many occurrences of ghosts will be grief phenomena, this mode of acceptance which goes by way of denial, and this kind of ghostly presence of the thing that you can't bear not to be present. To generalize from this, I would say something like this. Grief is what happens when there is a tear in the lived fabric of your world. Grief is not losing, it's not like losing an object, right? If I lose my favorite penknife, I'm very unlikely to go into grief. Even if I lose an acquaintance, well, we wouldn't really use the word lose, right? If one of my neighbors dies, or someone who I just sort of know kind of distantly in my philosophy department, I might be briefly sad, I might even attend their funeral, but I wouldn't feel grief. That person, it sounds a bit kind of harsh to put it this way, but this is how it is. That person is, roughly speaking, replaceable in my life, yeah? If one of my neighbors dies and I don't know them very well, I'll move on pretty quickly. Someone else will move in, and then I'll have a new neighbor. Grief is when you lose someone who is irreplaceable, yeah? And it isn't necessarily, as I've already implied, isn't necessarily even a human being. Grief is when you lose someone or something that is irreplaceable. So a part of your very world, a part of the structure or the fabric of your world is torn asunder. Yeah, that's why I say that grief is a tear or a rip in the very fabric of your world. Or to put it another way, grief is when you lose part of the ground. Grief isn't, it's not losing a figure that you can see. It's losing part of the ground against which background it makes sense for there to be figures. Someone you grieve for is someone who is part of your very world, right? And that's why it doesn't make sense for them not to be there. That's why it makes sense to substitute for them a phantom. That's why the mind can seem to have this incredible power of making present what is absent when we've lost someone who is so close to us. And many human beings have experienced this in one way or another. And grief, I think, shows us something essentially defective in the philosophy of liberal individualism, the philosophy which is hegemonic in our society. Liberal individualism, which basically says you are, in your essence, an individual separate from other individuals, and your destiny is to be free. Because grief teaches us that we are fundamentally united with each other, fundamentally connected with each other. When we care for someone deeply, when we have some kind of bond of love or something close to it with somebody, then we will feel grief when they are torn from us, and it will be incredibly painful. But you can also think of it the other way around. Would it be better not to have that pain? Well, if you didn't have that pain, that would be an indication that the love or the care wasn't as real as you had thought it was. Grief is about the way that we can be closer than close, connected to each other, interconnected. We can interbe, as the Buddhists sometimes put it. We can have our existence overlapping or co-constituting each other. This is again why I say that grief is a sign of the very fabric of our world being damaged. So then, that's my analysis in very brief of grief. How then should we understand ecological grief? Well, the step is not a very great one to take, it seems to me, between what I've just said and the phenomenon of ecological grief. If grief is a rip in the fabric of one's lived world, then ecological grief is a rip in the fabric of our living world. So again, when you prune the branches of a tree, you don't feel grief for the falling branches. If you see a wildebeest being taken by a lion on a safari, you almost certainly don't feel grief for the wildebeest. But if a beautiful wild place that you knew when you were growing up is damaged, or if a precious ecosystem is destroyed, or if a species is rendered extinct, well, these may be promptings for ecological grief, because something which was part of the very fabric of the living world and of your lived world, again, a token of some deep interconnection, has suddenly been fatally damaged, suddenly been taken from you. A particularly poignant example is the phenomenon of endlings. What is an endling? So an endling is the last of its kind, the last of its species. So I've seen a film, for example, of a certain male bird singing a song, and there was no one who responded to the song because this was the only bird left of its species. Something deeply kind of tragic about endlings, and there are more and more endlings all the time because of what our species has been doing. Ecological grief is when the living world has a rip in it. So what's the difference between ecological grief and ordinary grief? Well, the key difference is that ecological grief never stops, right? This is the tragic situation that we are in. When you lose somebody, you can gradually recover from that. Is that because they didn't matter to you? No, I've explained very clearly how grief is a token of somebody mattering to you just as much as anybody can matter to you. But they're not the only thing. They're not the only person that matters or mattered to you. We have this interconnection with many other humans, and indeed, as I've just described, with much that is more than human. So it's possible to recover from grief over the loss of a loved fellow human being, and to grow and deepen the interconnections you have with others. But with ecological grief, every time you start to recover from it, there's another hit. Yeah? Every time you're getting over the forest where you used to like to go when you were a kid, having been turned into a new housing estate, then you hear that one of your favourite species is on the brink of extinction, or whatever it might be. Yeah? Ecological grief keeps on hammering away at us because of the nature of the world as it is right now. How could we imagine this coming to an end? How could we imagine this being stopped? Well, I think there are only two possible ways that we could imagine it. One is by stopping feeling. One is by deadening yourself to the whole thing. Or by going into some sort of terminal denial, a denial which is not processual towards acceptance, but which is a sort of literalistic, absolute denial. And in fact, when one starts to understand grief and ecological grief in the way I've tried to outline so far, it becomes, I think, a lot more comprehensible why some people do go into denial about the nature of our ecological and climatic situation. So that's one possible way out of this horrible situation that we're in, of kind of endlessly ramifying ecological grief. The other possible way out, the only way out which one can with any decency seek to uphold, is to address the cause, right? If we were able to actually get into a situation where we stopped there being endlessly more hits, endlessly more causes for ecological grief, then we'd be able to start to recover in the way that we can recover from ordinary grief. And this is, I think, a very, very demanding but very, very powerful way in which ecological grief can motivate us. If we want to stop feeling ecological grief, the only way we can succeed in doing it is by somehow changing our current way of being and of destroying, such that there are no more causes for it. What else does ecological grief tell us? Well, just as ordinary grief, I think, shows us there's something wrong with liberal individualism, and I'd be happy to talk more about that with you in questions if you wish. So I think ecological grief shows us that there's something wrong with another of the major doctrines of our time, another of the sort of assumed ideologies by which we are possessed, the ideology, or the philosophy, if you will, of human supremacism, or of kind of extreme anthropocentrism, the idea that all that matters in this world is human beings, and that we are somehow separate from the rest of creation. Ecological grief shows us that, at least for very many of us, and I think for virtually all of us, in fact, and as I say, the only way it looks like people get to not feel any of this in the world as we inhabit it is by going into a kind of extreme denial. Ecological grief shows us a way in which human supremacism is a fundamentally untrue doctrine, a doctrine which our own lived experience countermands. The way that we are, so many of us, affected by what's been happening to nature or to particular parts of nature is a strong indication of the way that our values go beyond the merely human. Okay. So that's my analysis in outline of ecological grief. Now, what this understanding of grief and this understanding of ecological grief, I think, both clearly show is that grief is a sign of fundamental connection and interconnection, and ultimately, as I've already started to outline, of love. That just as I said that we might think of the various stages of grief as all versions of the acceptance to which grief ultimately, I believe, points, a certain kind of reintegration of the loved one and their absence into our lives. So I would suggest that the way that ecological grief and ordinary grief manifest a kind of love shows that the grief can be understood as a form of love. And not just grief. I would argue that, in fact, all emotions are forms of love. Let me clarify what I mean here by an emotion. I don't just mean a feeling. I don't just mean something like bodily pain or pleasure. At a crude first approximation, we could talk about this, actually, it's more complicated than this, but for the purposes of this talk, at a crude first approximation, pain and pleasure are not emotions, they are feelings. We simply undergo them. They simply happen to us. There's a wonderful remark by my main man, Wittgenstein, about this. Wittgenstein says somewhere, love is not a feeling. Pain, unlike love, cannot be put to the test. We do not say, that was not pain, or it wouldn't have stopped so quickly. Whereas we do say that of love, yeah? Somebody claims to love somebody, you notice them the next week seemingly very, very happy with somebody else. So it turns out you were just infatuated or something like that, right? Love is not a feeling. Pain, pleasure, those are feelings. Love is an emotion. And the claim I'm making now is that love is at the root of all emotions. That all emotions are forms of love. What could I possibly mean by this? Well, let's take some other examples briefly. Consider anxiety or fear, which we could talk about for a long period of time. But very roughly, we fear when we're worried, afraid, anxious, that the object of our fear is going to do something negative to us or to those that we love. Now you might say, well, yes, but isn't fear often to do with simply oneself? Isn't it an essentially egotistical response to things? Well, I would say, look, the self too is something that one can love. When I fear, typically I fear for those that I love, including myself. And if we think about eco-anxiety, well, isn't that exactly what it is? We are eco-anxious because we are afraid for our parents, because we are afraid more so for our children. Perhaps we are afraid for all children. Perhaps we are afraid for ourselves. But typically it's not only ourselves that we are afraid for. Or take anger. Anger, unlike grief, is an emotion which people feel a little bit kind of uncertain sometimes in owning up to. Grief is an emotion which is horrible to experience, just like fear is an emotion which is horrible to experience. Anger may not be so horrible to experience, although sometimes it is, but people feel a bit kind of uncertain about it because they think there's something kind of dodgy about anger. Perhaps anger is something which would be better to be suppressed. Anger can, of course, be very dangerous. But why are we angry? Well, typically we're angry when we think there's been some kind of injustice. Typically we're angry when we think that ourselves or somebody close to us or something that we care about is at risk or is being treated wrongly. In other words, my claim would be that a good way to understand anger, a good perspective through which to see anger, is that anger is what happens to love when it gets resisted. One is angry at somebody who is getting in the way of what it is that one loves. And if you think about this in terms of eco-anger is a less widely used term than eco-anxiety or ecological grief, but it's a term I think you'll be hearing more of, principally because I think the younger generation are going to express more and more eco-anger and climate anger over the coming years. I think we've only seen the beginnings of that. Eco-anger or climate anger is a resistance to an aggressive rejection of whatever is putting what we love at risk. So I'm making this bold claim that a good perspective through which to see the emotions is that they are all forms of love. And I think we can see this very clearly when we think about these eco-emotions and climate emotions, which are becoming more and more important in the times in which we live. One might kind of describe the idea I've just put forward in this way, as describing a kind of unity of the emotions. The great ancient philosopher Socrates, often regarded as the founder of Western philosophy, famously spoke of there being a unity of the virtues. Socrates says all virtues are really wisdom, because without wisdom you can't actually apply any of the other virtues, like temperance or courage and so forth. Like some philosophers, I'm uncertain whether Socrates is right. I think his analysis is a bit too sort of convenient for a philosopher. Philosophy literally means the love of wisdom, philosophia, the love of wisdom. And philosophers like to regard themselves, therefore, as people who are in pursuit of and possibly even in possession of some wisdom. And perhaps of more wisdom than others. There's a danger that this analysis that Socrates famously has of wisdom as what unifies the virtues, as being a way of philosophy kind of patting itself on the back. I'm putting the emphasis not on the wisdom part, but on the love part, and making a claim which I think is truer of the totality of human experience. Perhaps Socrates' way of seeing the virtues was a bit of a narrowly philosophical way. I'm trying to make a kind of broader claim which is more open to the fullness of human experience and which is not, as too much philosophy has been, negative towards the emotions. Yeah? On the contrary, I'm saying the emotions themselves contain wisdom, and the emotions themselves can be unified around love. And now let me give you one little example of this, of what I mean by this, that's directly relevant to our topic. So this is from a book by a novelist, a novelist called Jessie Greengrass. Wonderful name, very appropriate for her novel, which is called The High House, and which is a novel set in a post-apocalyptic England, more specifically a post-apocalyptic East Anglia, where I come from, so I really had to read it, but it is a very good book. And in this novel, the two central characters are two young women, one of whom is consumed by grief at the loss of her father in a climate disaster, and this grief is sort of interacts with a much broader grief that she feels about the destruction of the world that we are all at this moment still inhabiting together, and at the destruction of so much of nature as well. And at this moment in the novel, there is a huge climate-driven flood happening. And the two young women are trying to cross a bridge which is in the process of being flooded to get to a church to ring the church bells. Why are they trying to ring the church bells? As a warning. Who are they trying to warn? There's no one left living where they live, because the village where they live has been flooded and they're living in this one high house above it. But there's some kind of thought that, well, maybe there's someone in the distance who might hear it, and there's a nearby town, maybe they can get this warning to the town by ringing these church bells. It's the middle of the night, they're trying to cross the bridge, and here's what happens. So the narrator, whose name is Sal, says, "It's moving too fast. We have to go back, Caro." Caro is the other, the grief-stricken character. "It's too dangerous. If you fall in, it'll take you. You'll be swept away. For God's sake, turn around. Please, Caro." Caro shook her head. "Caro," I said, "this is absurd. There's no one to hear the bell. No one will come." "You don't know," she said. "You don't know there's no one. We haven't been watching the village. We haven't..." She threw her words across the roar of the flood, and I heard the tear in her throat, felt the muscles in her arm harden as she balled her fists tight at her sides. "There might be someone asleep. There might be someone. There might..." Fear came off her like a scent, but it was not fear for us. Caro was afraid for everyone, all at once. anyone who might be in the village, but more than that, anyone, everyone, all those that night who ran or didn't run, who waited through the dark for help which didn't come, who clung to their roofs, who packed their belongings into their cars and drove without a destination, all those who, all along the coast, were drowned already, or were drowning while the rain fell on them as it fell on us, soaking all it touched. It was fear that was compassion, and fear that was rage, and I felt the strength of it pulling us on. I took her hand, and we waded out together onto the bridge. Whew. It was fear that was compassion, and fear that was rage, and one might say fear that was grief. All of these things, it seems to me, one can see the way that one can make a claim seemingly as kind of extravagant and bold as the one I've made, that all emotions are ultimately love. One can, I think, see in a passage like that how one might ground a claim like that, especially at least in the times in which we are now living. To start to draw towards a close, the final topic I want to discuss with you here is the huge emergent mental health crisis that we are seeing. I say emergent. You might say, well, look, we've already got a massive mental health crisis. Mental ill health rates have skyrocketed. There's an epidemic of anxiety among teenagers, among university students. This has got to do with a number of things. It's got to do with social media to some extent. It's got to do a lot with inequality, as far as we can tell. The great Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett, based here at this university, have argued that extremely powerfully. It's got something to do with growing fears around the climate. Yeah, there is already a mental health epidemic, but maybe put it this way, it's not yet a pandemic. It will become a pandemic. Perhaps you're here this afternoon because, like myself, you've been suffering a great deal the past few years from eco-anxiety, from climate anxiety, from ecological grief. If you have, then you'll be well aware of how horrifically painful and difficult it can be to deal with, to have one's dreams become dominated by climate nightmares, to have daily life come to seem sometimes increasingly kind of bizarre and sort of impossible. How can everybody be so calm when we're all on the Titanic and we can see the iceberg straight in front of us, but we're still going towards it? But here's the thing. People like myself, and possibly like yourself, we are in fact the lucky ones. Why are we the lucky ones? Well, one way that we are the lucky ones is that we're experiencing this now while our society is still kind of relatively calm and orderly and organized. That is not likely to be the case for most of the lives of most of you in this room. And sooner or later, climate anxiety at least, and probably these other emotions as well that I've been discussing, they're going to come to everybody sooner or later. And it's probably better to be able to process them now in the relative calm than in a terrible hurry in the midst of something terrible, which is likely to be where we're heading. Another reason why we're the lucky ones is because it gives us a power. And I've already gestured at that power, yeah? Not to be too corny, it's the power of love. When you start to really feel and really face this kind of anxiety and grief, and then also when you start to talk about it and share it with others rather than keeping it to yourself. And at the moment, I think quite a lot of people are feeling it, but they're mostly keeping it to themselves. Then you start to experience a power which is something somewhat new in human history, although of course there are analogues of it before in previous somewhat similar situations. It's that power, for example, which has driven Greta Thunberg to be the incredible phenomenon that she is. It's that power that has also driven Extinction Rebellion. It's that power which enables those of us who've been Extinction Rebellion spokespeople, for example, to do things in the media and in speeches and so forth, which just haven't been done before, to manifest a kind of authenticity and a kind of emotional directness that kind of cuts through all the anti-green crap and enables the kind of shift in public consciousness which has happened in the last few years to have happened. And if I'm right in thinking that all of this is a form of love, well then it's just, really fantastic, albeit really painful, to participate in that love. Like I say, going back to so-called ordinary grief, you can't wish while you're feeling that grief not to be feeling it, because it'd be so much worse not to be feeling it. It'd be so much worse not to actually miss that person and not to know the strength of that love which is possible for human beings and that you've really actually experienced and still are experiencing. And here, of course, is the really exciting reason why it's a good thing to be experiencing these painful emotions now rather than later. To go back to something I said a little while ago, this is the one thing that could actually stop the emotion, the pain, going on forever. Yeah? The one way in which we might get to stop ecological grief is by really experiencing it sooner rather than later. The sooner we experience it, the more we experience it, the more possibility there is of our being able to stop ourselves and others from having to experience endlessly more of it in the future. So this is the final paradox, if you will, that if you're someone who is sitting in this audience from a sort of purely academic point of interest, if you're sort of like, oh, I'd like to understand something about ecological grief, it's not something which I experience myself, then I want to say to you, please don't leave those of us who are experiencing it alone in that experience, because it's very painful to be alone in that experience, but also because the sooner you join us in that pain, the less of that pain there will be for others and for you in the future. And that's the point at which I would like to finish. This is the sense in which the argument that I want to make is that ecological grief could even yet be the making of us. It and the other emotions which all come from love, which I've described in this lecture here this afternoon, ecological grief and these other emotions are, I believe, the one thing which might empower and enable us not to get caught permanently in ecological despair and ecological depression. Those two have their place, but you do not want to get stuck in them permanently. The way we get to not get stuck in them permanently is if we allow ourselves to really manifest the full panoply of ecological grief, of climate anxiety, of all the associated phenomena, of the love which they all spring from now. Thank you.